Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really plunging into Sweden's unique genetic story. I mean, think about it. Thousands of years of, well, relative isolation, those brutal winters, the whole Viking expansion thing, and even modern ideas like egalitarianism. What kind of genetic narrative does that actually create?
It's a fascinating question.
We really want to get beyond the easy stereotypes, blonde hair, blue eyes, that kind of thing, and uncover what's really special about Sweden's DNA. Might be some surprises in there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's definitely a deep and complex story. This dive, it's going to show echoes of, well, ancient hunter-gatherers, the huge genetic footprint of Indo-European steppe warriors, the Vikings, of course, and even some, unexpected gene flows maybe from the south. It's like a genetic tapestry woven over millennia. Now, obviously, when you talk about population genetics, especially nationally, it can sometimes brush up against sensitive topics, things like historical eugenics or health risks, even national identity.
Right.
So we should be really clear. Our aim here is just to understand this fascinating genetic story, definitely not to endorse any particular ideology. We're simply exploring the information in the sources you shared with us.
Got it. Okay, so let's start unpacking that genetic blueprint then. Scientists have done some really incredible work, haven't they? Big DNA mapping projects like the Sweden study. That sampled thousands of people across all the Swedish counties.
That's right, a huge effort.
So before we get into the specific haplogroups, what was the biggest surprise maybe, or the most counterintuitive thing that came out of mapping all those genomes? Did it challenge that idea of genetic homogeneity?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you might assume this very uniform genetic landscape, but what's actually remarkable is how layered Sweden's genetic makeup truly is. One striking finding is that roughly 40% of Swedes carry the R1b haplogroup.
Okay.
R1b, and just to clarify for everyone, a haplogroup, it's basically a big genetic family tree marker, mostly passed down the male line. Think of it like a really ancient surname on your Y chromosome.
All right.
So R1b is common across Western Europe, sure. But in Sweden, it seems particularly tied to the Viking expansion period and maybe even older Celtic movements.
Interesting.
But then you've got another big chunk, about 25%, carrying haplogroup I1. Now, this one is really one of the oldest Northern European lineages. Researchers think it connects pretty directly back to those, well, incredibly tough Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who actually survived the last ice age right there in Scandinavia.
Wow.
Leaving a very deep genetic mark. So you have this mix, right? Huge historical movements, but also this really ancient, unbroken lineage.
That is fascinating. It really is like a genetic time capsule.
Right.
And connecting that to the bigger picture, you mentioned some, well, less expected influences too.
Absolutely. Sweden also has noticeable amounts, maybe 12 to 15% of what we'd call Eastern Eurasian ancestry.
Okay. Where does that come from?
This is largely thought to be from Uralic-speaking populations, specifically the Sami people, and also Finnish genetic influence. It's particularly strong up in the northern region.
Right. Makes sense geographically.
So yeah, when you put it all together, the Swedish genome isn't just one single story. It's much more of a mosaic.
So it really does sound like, at its core, the Swedish genome is a kind of cold weather survivor's blueprint. Speaks to resilience, adaptation, but also this surprising diversity hidden under what seems like a uniform surface.
That's a good way to put it. Resilience and hidden layers.
Now, you mentioned isolation earlier. Let's dig into that. How has Sweden's geography, being a bit tucked away, impacted its genetics? Because it does have lower overall genetic diversity than many other European countries, right? Especially in some rural spots like Norrbotten or Jämtland.
Yes, exactly. That isolation factor is key.
So how does that lower diversity play out? Are there challenges, benefits maybe from a research angle?
Well, it raises really important points about what happens in genetic isolation. And scientists have found that, yes, some of these isolated Swedish populations show higher frequencies of certain genetic disorders.
Ah, like what?
A key example is hereditary hemochromatosis. That's an iron overload condition. And it's known to be more common in northern Swedes. Another aspect, though maybe more of an adaptation, is extremely high lactose tolerance, over 95% in Swedes. That points to a really strong long-term adaptation to dairy farming.
Wow, 95%. That's incredibly high. So that iron overload thing, is that typical for isolated groups everywhere, or is there something specific about Sweden?
It is a common pattern you see globally in isolated populations, yeah. Rare genetic variants can just, by chance, become more common when the gene pool is smaller, founder effects, genetic drift, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But here's the kind of silver lining, if you want to call it that, for Sweden. This lower diversity, this relative homogeneity in certain areas, it's actually incredibly useful for medical research.
How so?
Well, institutions like the Karolinska Institute and Sweden's amazing biobanks, they become massive global resources. They're perfect for studying rare diseases because you have a higher concentration of cases, sometimes linked to specific families or regions, and also for pharmacogenetics.
Right, pharmacogenetics, how our genes affect drug responses.
Exactly. Understanding how someone's specific genetic makeup influences how they respond to medications. It lets researchers develop much more personalized, effective treatments.
Yeah.
So these Swedish biobanks are, well, invaluable for that kind of work.
That sounds incredibly promising, a real medical frontier kind of born out of this unique genetic history. But wait, does that mean treatments developed based on this maybe less diverse population might not work as well for more genetically diverse groups elsewhere? Is there a potential downside there?
That's a really crucial point, actually, and researchers are very aware of it. While insights from these biobanks can definitely speed up discoveries, it's absolutely vital to then test those findings across diverse populations worldwide.
Right.
You have to ensure the treatments are broadly applicable and don't accidentally create therapies that only work well for one specific genetic profile. It just highlights the constant need for, really inclusive research globally.
Okay, that makes sense. So this unique genetic profile, it's offered amazing insights, even medical breakthroughs, partly because of its history of isolation. But as you said, delving into a nation's history and identity, it's not always straightforward, is it?
No, it isn't.
And some of these very genetic concepts we're discussing, while they've been tragically misused in Sweden's past, it casts a long shadow that we probably need to acknowledge.
Yes, that's absolutely crucial for a full picture. And our sources do highlight these chapters, and partially, of course. One very dark period is often called the Eugenics era.
Right, I've read a bit about that.
Yeah, between about 1935 and 1976, Sweden actually sterilized over 63,000 people. This was done under what they called racial hygiene laws.
63,000, that's staggering.
It is, and these laws often targeted people who were just deemed genetically unfit. Now, obviously, modern Sweden is a leader in human rights and scientific ethics, but this period, it definitely remains a significant shadow over how genetics were discussed and, well, applied back then.
A very dark chapter indeed.
And then there's the whole intersection of, like, Viking mythology and modern nationalism.
Ah, yes. The romanticized Viking image.
Exactly. That glorification of Viking ancestry, often painted as purely Swedish or Nordic, has unfortunately been, misused by extremist groups. They twist history to push these false claims of racial superiority.
But that's not accurate, is it? Weren't the Vikings more diverse?
Precisely. Historians stress that the Vikings were actually a really multi-ethnic group. Their ranks included Slavs, Celts. They traded widely. There's evidence of contact with Arab traders, too. It completely counters that narrow, exclusionary narrative some people try to push.
It's important to remember that complexity.
And finally, related to genetics and identity, we have to acknowledge the historical treatment of the Sami people.
Sweden's indigenous population.
Yes. For decades, they were subjected to racial classification, forced assimilation policies, even these invasive anthropometric studies measuring skulls and bodies.
Oh, awful.
Yeah. And even though modern Sweden now acknowledges Sami rights and is working towards reconciliation, the very genetic studies that were once used to dehumanize them, well, they remain a really sensitive, difficult topic, a challenging legacy.
That's a lot to take in. It really underscores how scientific ideas, when they're stripped of ethics and basic human rights, can be twisted to cause immense harm.
It's a stark reminder.
Okay, so having confronted some of those darker aspects where genetics were tragically weaponized, let's maybe pivot to something a bit lighter, though still fascinating. Beyond disease and history, you often hear these descriptions of Swedes, right? Reserved, calm, very egalitarian. Is it possible, even remotely, that millennia of evolution, the same forces shaping their DNA, could play any role in this perceived national character?
The nature versus nurture question applied to personality. It's definitely intriguing. And our sources show scientists are, understandably, very cautious about drawing direct lines between specific genes and complex traits like personality. It's rarely that simple.
Right. I imagine it wouldn't be like a single calm gene.
Exactly. But what we can look at is epigenetics. And epigenetics, just to quickly define it, is the study of how your environment and behaviors can actually switch genes on or off, affecting how they work without changing the underlying DNA sequence.
Okay.
So epigenetic studies suggest that factors like climate, those long winters again, plus long-standing social norms,
Yeah.
maybe even stress resilience developed over time, could interact with certain gene expressions related to mood or behavior.
So it's more of a subtle interplay, not a direct genetic command, but maybe nudges or predispositions interacting with the environment.
Precisely. It's all about the interplay. For instance, researchers have noted high frequencies of specific serotonin receptor variants in the Swedish population. Serotonin, as you know, is key for emotional regulation, mood.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, Swedes also tend to show, on average, lower activity of an enzyme called MAOA. This enzyme breaks down neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine.
Okay, so lower breakdown might mean...
Well, it might correlate with greater emotional steadiness. It's hypothesized this could even be an adaptation, perhaps helping maintain mood stability during those long, dark winters with low daylight.
Fascinating possibility.
But again, the key takeaway is that it's not nature versus nurture. The science really points towards nature and nurture together, constantly interacting, shaping who we are, including maybe some group-level tendencies.
That feels like a much more realistic and nuanced way to look at it, far from any kind of simple genetic determinism. So, as we bring this deep dive towards a close, what is it then that makes Sweden's genetic story truly special? What's the core message?
I think what's most compelling is just how multifaceted the story is. You see ancient survival literally getting through the Ice Age in Scandinavia, then the profound impact of that relative isolation, shaping both unique strengths like we discussed with research, but also specific vulnerabilities. And it also seems to reveal this deep cultural resilience, one that maybe expresses itself more through science and careful adaptation today, rather than any outdated notions of supremacy. It's ultimately about maybe a quiet power of adaptation, something visible in the DNA perhaps, but also reflected in the national identity itself.
That's a great summary. The quiet power of adaptation. And that really feels like the core takeaway for you, the listener. Sweden's genome isn't about purity or some single ideal type. It's really about a profound long-term ability to thrive, to adapt, and to evolve, much like the people it belongs to.
Well said.
So, as you think about all this, what surprised you the most about Sweden's genetics? And here's a bigger question, perhaps. Do you think national DNA shapes culture, or is it more that culture shapes how we even interpret DNA?
Good questions to ponder.
We encourage you to mull those over, maybe explore the fascinating, complex truth behind identity one gene at a time.